Ariana, are you about ready to go? We're so excited to hear about you and a little bit more about your experience with intersectionality, labor, and unions.
Yes, thank you for having me so much. Can everybody hear me and see the presentation?
I can see the presentation myself. I assume everyone else can, yes.
Sweet. Right. Well, since you already sort of gave a presentation, this is me. I am a journeyman electrician. I do work through the union. There's about 2,500 of us who work through the union. I do primarily commercial and industrial electrical work, and almost all my coworkers, of course, are dudes. So it's a very interesting work environment. I also volunteer with KKFI, which is our community radio station. I've been volunteering with them for about 5 or 6 years now, with the Heartland Labor Forum, which is our local 30-year-old labor radio show here in Kansas City. Been going for a long, long time. I also do a 5-minute labor history feature every second Thursday on that show. And the Heartland Labor Forum is every Thursday at 6 p.m. And I also do the activist calendar. Here's how you subscribe on Facebook. It's a collection of all the different social justice work around the area that I can find from all the different aspects of the movements, trying to get people a better life, better wages, whatever. So I try to, that way everybody can see what everybody else is working on and see how much progress we're really making around here. So what is a labor union? A labor union or a trade union is an organized group of workers who unite to make decisions about conditions affecting their work. Back, in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of workers they didn't necessarily have any land to live on. They didn't have an income. And so they were really attracted to the booming cities where these huge factories were opening. But the problem is the conditions in these factories were terrible. This young woman, this is back a drawing, back before there were photographs. A lot of young women who were immigrants, particularly, were targeted. They were recruited into these factories, sometimes as young as 10 years old, and they worked 60 hours a week and longer. They had the windows shut, so the fibers, which are numerous, I work in industrial environments, the fibers in these plants accumulate so fast. But they were breathing these fibers. Of course, there was no electricity, so they were breathing the oil lamp fumes. And women would pass out, women would collapse, women would lose fingers. It was brutal. And so people wanted to do something about it. And so here's also, of course, child labor also was rampant. A lot of families didn't have a choice. They had to make ends meet, and people were allowed to hire children, and so they did. And they paid them half the rate of an adult, say. So people had to send their kids, even as young as this. These are coal miners. They're losing fingers. They're potentially being crushed by these large coal carts, cave-ins. All kinds of things could be happening to these children. A lot of times they led the donkey that drug the coal cart. So, people decided eventually that they'd had enough of this, and they decided that they wanted to have some limitations on what their boss was able to put them through. So early on, there was a movement for the 8-hour day. So people said, it's a 24-hour day. I think it's reasonable that people should work for 8 hours. They should get 8 hours off, and they should get 8 hours to sleep, and rest. So that should be, what we go for as a society as a minimum standard for people. So here are, this is just the basic background on labor history, so that I can then talk about what we've done here in Kansas City locally in the past. So here's 10 things that unions got us over time. These are things that individual people like us talked to their coworkers and organized, and then those unions talked to each other and organized, and whole cities went on strike and things like that. People got shot, people got murdered in order to get some of these things. So these are all things that unions got for us back in the past. So what role has Kansas City played in these struggles? So I'm going to start off. There's actually quite a few things that have happened in Kansas City that have contributed to this, what we have today. But I have to limit things. So I'm going to start with the Armadale meatpacking strike of 1917. This was the factory. It was over in KCK. I don't know if it's still standing or not, but it was one of several. There were several other companies that had meatpacking factories all right here in this area. So 10 to 15,000 people marched in the Kansas City Labor Day Parade of 1917. The next day, September 4th, 275 Cudahy cannery workers in KCK who didn't have a union, that is to say they were unorganized, walked off their jobs. These workers started a strike wave that would see 10,000 unorganized workers walking off the job that month. The common demands that emerged were the right to an 8-hour day and the demand that the employer recognize their union. The Cudahy plant was racially diverse, employing Black and white workers as well as many others, as well as employing both men and women. The whole thing started due to the firing of one man named Harry Marshall, who had dared to ask the boss for the 8-hour day and for a raise to keep pace with wartime inflation. Within 2 days of Harry's firing, almost 2,400 of Cudahy's workers had walked out, with the notable exception of the refrigerator operators, who had been left on the job intentionally to maintain the freezers full of meat. On Friday the 7th, another 150 workers from the Wilson Packing House joined the workers of Cudahy. Meetings were held at Shawnee Park to organize the workers, as well as breakout sessions for committees and leaders. Officials were dispatched to KC from the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and American Federation of Labor to assist, and it's worth noting that similar actions also happened in Chicago, Omaha, and beyond. Sarah Lloyd Green of the Women's Trade Union of Kansas City assisted with organizing the many and racially diverse women workers. Of the 43-person worker committees established on September 7th, 12 of them were composed of women. Ms. Issa Eichmann, Mabel Madden, and Marie Martin were put in charge of devising a set of demands on behalf of all of the women workers. And she was said to have possessed in her eulogy, she was said to have possessed a religious faith in trade unionism as the salvation of working people. That's pretty high praise. So Saturday the 8th did not bring a more general meatpacking strike to Kansas City, but what it did bring was further strikes by railroad workers at Union Station, by freight handlers and clerks at West Bottoms, and by soap workers, many of whom were women, at Pete Brothers Soap. At Shawnee Park, George W. Reed, who became the vice president of the strike committee, implored his fellow workers, "All we ask is that when you divide up the pie, do not forget your colored brother." In fact, Black workers were organized avidly by the workers themselves and outside assistance, since the National Council of Colored Workers had been founded just a few days earlier at 18th and Vine in response to the race riots of St. Louis earlier that summer. By September 11th, around 4,000 workers had walked off the job at the meatpacking facilities of Cudahy, Armour, Wilson, Swift, Morris, Fowler, and Reddy Thomas. The Kansas City stockyards were quiet as there was nobody to cut up the meat. After Armour owner Ogden Armour used the press on the 12th to accuse workers of succumbing to foreign and IWW influence, I'm a member of the IWW, you gotta watch us. A small riot broke out outside the gates of Armour around James and Central. Company guards opened fire on strikers and bricks were hurled onto them from the top of the building, resulting in many injuries and the death of one striker named Ora Ward. By 8:30, there were over 10,000 strikers and sympathizers outside the gates of Armour, though no further violence occurred. By the end of the workday on Thursday the 13th, the strike was brought to an end by federal mediator Patrick Gill. By that time, 6,000 meatpacking workers had joined the strike. The deal gave workers a raise, as well as union recognition as a part of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen of North America. Packing facilities reopened on the morning of the 14th, but there was a bit of a disturbance because 300 or 400 immigrant non-speaking coworkers showed up en masse to picket, and people had a hard time communicating to them that the strike was over and that they had won. During settlement negotiations, the meatpacker company owners asked Sarah Green if she was a German. They were trying to say she must be a foreign agent, as German phobia was in vogue at that time. Sarah replied, "No, sir, I am Welsh, and have no use either for the German Kaiser nor any of the industrial Kaisers of this country." So that brings us from 1917 up to 1918. The events in 1917 were not concluded. They rolled into the next year. So great strike underway in Kansas City. Walkout began at 8 o'clock this morning with barbers, bartenders, and brewers in the forefront of the fray. Strubble reported this afternoon. Sympathetic strike called to aid laundry drivers brought out 700 cardmen from other unions in the first call. That is from the Leavenworth Herald back in 1918. The Kansas City General Strike is distinguished in being the first of only 2 general strikes ever to have been called in solidarity with a majority female workforce, the other being Oakland many decades later. In fact, many of the workers were also Black. Its roots began in December 1917 with the strike of around 300 men who drove laundry delivery trucks around Kansas City. When the bosses refused to negotiate with the drivers, around 1,000 women laundry workers joined the men on strike. These women were black and white and worked long hours indoors with heavy chemicals and poor ventilation. The two groups of workers refused to return to work until each other's demands were met for union recognition and pay raises. Strikes erupted across the laundry districts of the city, with militant street demonstrations seizing scab laundry trucks and in some cases crashing them. As you can see, also there were riots that destroyed local laundry businesses. At one point, National Guard ended up coming. At one point, local progressive women members of the Jackson County National Council of Defense and others held a meeting between the laundry owners and women strikers, which they attempted to mediate. However, the Hotel Mulebach, where the meeting was held, was managed under Jim Crow rules, and the black women laundry worker leaders were refused entry to the hotel. Upon hearing this, the white women's laundry worker leaders walked out. The hosts wanted to know why the laundry owners were allowed their own association, the Laundry Owners Association, while forbidding the workers from having an association of their own. But no satisfactory answer could be provided. Sarah Lloyd Green of the KC Women's Trade Union League, you may remember from 1917, a waitress by trade and an active organizer of waitresses, was almost physically assaulted during the meeting by the leader of the Laundry Owners Association, despite there being witnesses all around. Ms. Green was the lead organizer of the Women Commercial Laundry Workers, aggressively championed a general strike among the various union locals in Kansas City. After weeks of turmoil and the rest of Kansas City organized labor watching armed mercenaries beating strikers on the street, a general strike was finally called for March 27th in solidarity with these workers. Immediately out walked the building trades, electricity plant and brewery workers, barbers and porters, many of whom already had labor beefs of their own with their own employers. A crowd of 1,000 freed some of their number from detention by a police paddy wagon and then set it on fire. Private guards at a laundry location shot a worker named Alonzo Millsap to death. The first night, strikers roamed the streets, accosting still open restaurants and hotels, eliciting response by the National Guard. The next day, the newly unionized streetcar workers joined the fray. Workers in the downtown area, who were already working without heat in many cases due to the strike, got word of the streetcar strike 2 hours before it took effect, and a mass scramble to get home took place in a city which was mostly served by the streetcar at the time. No one but the rich had their own cars. 2 scab trolley cars, which were still running, were burned by strikers. And even with National Guard protection, only partial streetcar service was maintained during the strike. Women laundry workers and others were reported throwing rocks at scab streetcars all over the city. As the night began, tailors joined the strike, as well as movie theater attendants, leading to the closure of 71 local movie theaters. The 5th day of the general strike was on Easter Sunday, and things were relatively quiet. But the next day, bakers around Kansas City also walked out. Kansas City bakeries attempted to stock baked goods from St. Louis bakeries, but St. Louis bakery workers refused to provide extra scab goods. On the 7th day, the general strike finally ended with a draw. In all, an estimated 25,000 workers around Kansas City had taken part in the general strike. Striking laundry workers were hired back without letting go of the scabs, but without union recognition. Raises were promised, but the companies broke their promises. And with no formally recognized union, the leaders were fired and nothing could be done to make the owners honor the raises. The strike ended with some confusion, with returning streetcar workers told they could no longer wear union buttons on the clock. The workers balked, and after only a few hours, management changed their mind and reallowed the buttons. Many building trades workers remained locked out over their own job issues, and some 1,200 cooks, waiters, and waitresses also refused to return without a raise and improved working conditions. The legacy of the strike lived further. Just a few months later, the streetcar workers, who had initially resisted pushes to hire women conductors, relented, and Kansas City boasted the only streetcar union in the country to include women members. So that brings us along to the STFU. It doesn't stand for what you think it does. It actually stands for the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. That was before internet culture, so they had no way of knowing, but I'm sure they would have found it amusing if they had. So what is a tenant farmer, you may ask? A tenant farmer is a person who rents the land that they live on. It's also pretty much the same thing as a sharecropper. A I believe it's the sharecropper that's technically in a slightly better situation, but they both really suck. So a tenant farmer lives on the land, and they live on the land and they grow crops. They give most of the crops to the owner of the land. And there was a lot of insecurity for these people, particularly by the time the Great Depression hit. A lot of farmers, kind of like some landlords now, there was no incentive for them to keep up the houses. There was no incentive for them to actually take care of anything or keep tenants long term. They found that they could find, there was a lot of insecurity, so there's a lot of people looking. So they could get a new tenant for the next year and give them a 90% share of what they gave the person the year before. So there was a lot of insecurity. The system began in the United States in the 1870s as a new exploitative means to replace former slave labor. The crops tenants grew were usually given to the owner, and then the tenant got a cut of the profit back. So this little girl is a tenant farmer, and those are some of the homes of the tenant farmers who live on her farm. So we don't have a lot of information about some of the early labor things, such as what we spoke about before, and we don't have a lot of photos because there just weren't a lot of people walking around with cameras, and there weren't a lot of people walking around writing things down, unfortunately, about this at least. So as labor history gets further along, you get a lot more sources. So thankfully, by the time this story comes along, we have someone named Louise Boyle. She was a young woman who was coming out of college. I believe she was when she went down to the South, and she wanted to document the hardship of poor farmers in the American South, particularly poor Black farmers. So here are some children who are living in a neighborhood that is they're tenant farmers. In some places, the tenant farmers were largely one race or another, white or Black. There are also some immigrants and Native Americans who got sucked into the tenant farmer trap. But some communities were segregated, and some were quite mixed. So as you can see, this neighborhood was quite mixed together. They played together. They also worked together. Tenant farming relied on tenant farmers having large families full of kids, and labor began very young. This child is out picking groceries, picking stuff in the field. So can you imagine having to shuck that many beans? I mean, that just honestly just makes my heart sink looking at that pile. But these children are, drafted into the labor force, and this is how the country was fed. And it's pretty much still the same thing now, except the children aren't white. They're immigrant, undocumented workers. But this, this food system was reliant on the work of poor children living in poverty. These families had, 10, 12, 15 kids. All of my family comes from these people. They were tenant farmers themselves. My grandfather, I believe, was one of 12, and my grandmother, I want to say, was one of 14. So, yeah. So, this was the reality for these people. They lived in extreme poverty. We're talking about Missouri. We're talking about Mississippi, Oklahoma, and several other states in that area, Arkansas. So this is this entire family crammed into this tiny little shack, and they're all, trying to. That poor mother, she's trying to feed all these people. Luckily, she has all of her daughters to help her because labor was relatively gender segregated, although everybody, as you could see from the bean shucking, got in on the farm labor. So this is this woman's home. As you can see, things seem a little off. So this is the inside of her home. Look at her floor. This is the conditions that the owner of the land was all right with them living in. They were making him money, and as long as they kept making money, that was fine. So at the same time, this is where the owner of that farm lived. This is the house that the owner of the farm lived in while the woman was living in that shack. So, I have to wonder if Louise Boyle snuck up on her stomach behind a bush with her little camera and snuck a picture. You gotta wonder. So they decided to do something about it. They finally decided, things were rough, and they decided that they would form a union, even though they weren't quite a technical, normal, what you would think of as a wage worker. So tenants in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and Missouri formed the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in 1934 with the goal of using collective action to achieve better working conditions and pay for tenant farmers. By this point, the Great Depression was well underway. Banks were calling in loans, leading landowners to have to cut costs or even sell the farm. At the same time, the tractor was plowing a new revolution in farming and replacing animal-driven tenant farmer plowing and farming. tenants weren't needed anymore, and instead were being replaced by day laborers who drove tractors and worked by the hour. Farmers needed money, but were overproducing. So the federal government, as part of the New Deal economic incentives, gave farmers owners subsidies to compensate them for not planting more crops. It was kind of expected that they would pass some of the subsidy on to their tenants, but that's not what really happened in most cases. Here are some of the photos of their meeting. They organized to demand better living conditions, better compensation, to a right to some of the subsidies and more. And they have singing at their meetings too. I'm a little ahead of myself on the slides. I'll go back. There's the singing. So here are so people were angry, as you can see. The man, there's different portraits of anger. Everyone has a common interest here, and race is really not important to them. They're all worried about their families and how they're going to feed and shelter their families. But there's also a lot of hope. The hope in this old man's eyes. You know, back when this was taken, this man was born during slavery. He was probably about 5 years old when slavery was ended, and now he sees his neighbors coming together, regardless of race, to try to get better conditions. That photo inspires me quite a bit. So I thought I'd remove that photo. But as you can see, members came, their whole families came, regardless of race, regardless of, you know, who they had with them. They brought their children. It's like going to Sunday church or going to Oasis. People they're hopeful. People have humor. So finally, things got so bad, and the mass evictions and unemployment got so bad that they were evicted and hungry, and they didn't know what to do. So a large group of Missouri STFU members in southeastern Missouri gathered along Highway 60 on January 10th, 1939. They had nowhere to go, and they had to carry everything with them that they owned. No one cared about them, and they didn't know what to do. So they decided that they would set up a demonstration on the side of the highway where people had to look at them and their children as they traveled by. This group was mixed as far as race goes. There were Black and white demonstrators, young and old demonstrators. They were taking a risk with the Missouri sharecropper roadside demonstration that they would rouse the attention of the Ku Klux Klan. Tenants had long been victims of violence and repression by their bosses, the landlords, and the Ku Klux Klan. There had been many threats and some violence against the STFU due to their interracial organizing. Many people were living in nothing but tents, and it was bitterly cold. As you can see, here's one of those tents, and they've rigged a potbelly stove into it. Eventually, the Missouri Highway the group was mixed as far as race goes. There were Black and white demonstrators. Lost my place. Many people were living in nothing but tents, and it was bitterly cold. The American Red Cross refused to help because they said it was a man-made disaster. Eventually, the Missouri Highway Patrol was dispatched to load up the demonstrators and cart them off somewhere out of sight. That was pretty well what their instructions were. Luckily, though, in the course of their demonstration, the tenant farmers had managed to make allies. Students from the Lincoln University and students and activists from the St. Louis Committee for the Rehabilitation of Sharecroppers saw them on the side of the road and decided that they would organize in their community to help these people. And so these people assisted the tenant farmers in fundraising in their community, as well as getting funding from the Farm Security Administration, and helped these tenant farmers to form their own new cooperative farming communities. I believe there were around 10 formed altogether. And these communities were broadly called what the original was called, which was Cropperville. The tenant farmers couldn't stop the revolution of tractors or the reorganization of farm production that they had brought, but they did use their numbers to win support from their society to transition to a new mode of living. So in that sense, they were successful. Louise Boyle returned 30 years later to photograph Cropperville and had a reunion with her friends there. There are many other episodes in labor history in the Midwest and the United States that we can draw a lot of inspiration from. I could be here all day long. There are still many more fights to fight now. Many people are working more than 8-hour days, once again. They're working more than 40 in a week, without retirement, without access to health care. Many people my age are either living paycheck to paycheck, or they're saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, or both. Sexual and racial harassment and discrimination are still rampant. The minimum wage is nowhere near a living wage. There are many areas that labor unions can and are fighting to improve things even further for workers today. I don't think it's ever been clearer than right now when you see these headlines that access to healthcare should be a human right. Thank you.
All right.
Questions?
Yes. Thank you so much, Ariana, for talking about that. It's amazing you hear that kind of thing and you just don't remember that people don't have weekends guaranteed, and it's not just something that kind of just occurs. It's something that was fought for and that was earned by many, many brave people who made it happen.
Yeah, sacrifice their lives in some cases. Yes, sacrifice their lives in some cases.
Yeah, that's incredible, and we just kind of take it for granted that that's the way it should be. 40 hours a week, where does that number come from? We just kind of assume that there's a reason, but we don't really care. Maybe like 24 hours in a day. Why? It just is. That's incredible. For everybody who's on the stream, we are going to have a Q&A with Ariana right about now, and the format for this is going to be, you're going to first, like, if you go into your messaging, you can select everyone or you can select just somebody. And so if you go there and you select just me, you can just send your question to me, or if you can't get that to work, you can put it in the questions and I will read that out. So type it up and I will read that out, and we'll have both the question and Ariana's answer read aloud so everybody can hear it. All right, so we've got a couple questions. So Ariana, one of the questions is, another labor movement is due in this person's opinion. Are there any predictions of like where the labor unions are going? Is there movements for it to increase? I know personally that there's been some efforts on parts of corporations like Tesla and Walmart to suppress unionization. What do you see happening with that?
Well, right now, we recently had a strike wave by teachers, and that's still ongoing. Teachers got a raise in quite a few areas. I grew up in rural Oklahoma, Woody Guthrie country, and we didn't have any progressive teachers that were out, at least. But even my high school walked out, and my physics teacher led the charge. So the teachers, they're getting material gains even now. I do labor radio. I'm used to y'all being able to hear me, but not being able to see me. But there's been a general unrest throughout the world this last about 18 months. We're definitely coming into another strike wave. The teachers is just one aspect of that, but people are becoming more alert and more aware of, like what you said, the rights that we still have didn't just come out of the ether. They weren't just given, as Utah Phillips would say, they weren't given to us by a benign and benevolent management. They were fought and died for. People literally put their lives, their families' livelihoods on the line. They went through what a lot of service workers are going through right now with things closing, but they did it by choice. They chose to put their family through that with all of their coworkers on the gamble that maybe they would be able to make another $1 an hour.
So one other question that's coming up is what is labor in the age of automation and computers look like for you? You touched a little bit on tractors replacing certain types of jobs, and you seem to indicate that, the people were motivated maybe partially by the Great Depression to organize because they just got to the point where they couldn't, live on what they had. How do you think those two factors will affect labor movements in the future? Automation and that pressure, like I cannot live on the amount of wages that I'm getting right now because people can't get enough time at their waitressing job or at their service job. Right.
Well, we're going to have to move away from this conception that your production value is your social value. I mean, that pretty well says you're only important if you're working and you're contributing to society. Well, what about grandma? What about children? What about people who are disabled? What about people who are not able to contribute? What about people who are ill? Whatever. People need to be able to. We need to move away from that conception. People's have a right to life. People have a right to shelter, to food, to medical care. That's about to probably become a very important issue in this country. Yes. And that may, as bad as this may get, it may give the labor movement and just people in general more of a kick in the pants to say, there's evictions have been frozen in Kansas City for the next 2 weeks by Mayor Lucas. Why do they have to be reinstated when it's over? People are going to start looking around and they're asking these questions like, why do we have to go back to the way things were before? So that's kind of my hope.
Absolutely. I see that probably being a question as well. People realizing why things are the way they are and wondering why they can't continue that way. That's a very good point. Another question up here is, have labor unions here in Kansas City stayed intersectional? Did the civil rights movement have any impact on how diverse unions are today?
Oh my goodness. I have a friend who is a retired IBW journeyman in New Jersey, and he's a white guy, but he was a member of the Panthers back in the day. And he's a wonderful resource, and I love talking to him. But he told me, don't ever forget that the unions took you and took Black people because they were forced to by law. Every great social institution that we have ever built has immediately been beset by people who are desperate to form a career, who will sell other people out for their own interest. That's the case in religion, as I'm sure some people may have noticed, and many other, pretty well everything we've ever done has been corrupted. So, you have to keep that in mind. But my union personally is finally kind of moving with the pressure, as many others are, and they're obligated by some, I believe, local ordinances as well as federal initiatives to hire more women and to hire more minorities. But the problem right now is they're hiring them, and this is just generally speaking. I talk to people all over the country in different unions, so this is just general in the trades. The changes are being made, the people are being brought in, but they're not necessarily being supported once they're in, so they're being lost. So, there's a lot of hostility to the only Black person on the job or the only woman on the job. You're automatically the other. And if there's some, if work slows down, we're always working ourselves out of a job. So guess who gets laid off first?
Right.
So there's a lot of problems to be overcome for sure, just as anything else. But it really, the difference is the amount of people that are in it going, this is what needs to happen. This is what's going to happen.
For sure. Just to piggyback on that, what have you seen? Has there been anything that has been more effective than maybe other things to try and encourage diversity in unions?
Really the most effective thing is the people that are already in the union, the people who are people of color, women, etc., need to organize together. And there is some effort to do that within the union to try to help them to do that. There's also hostility, of course. As some people may have seen, a lot of our members in the IBW in particular and trade unions voted for Trump. There's a lot of difference in opinion throughout the union, and so it makes it very difficult to move in any direction because we're almost evenly split.
Yeah, and
so
not
there's a lot of people that are pulling and pushing.
Yeah, that's good. Do you see any workers maybe taking advantage of the opportunity that we're in right now with a lot of people being laid off and various other things? Do you see that being a something that accelerates the rate at which people unionize, or do you see it as something that may not come to people's minds? How do you think that's going to affect people?
I don't know. I mean, there's not going to be a lot of distractions if things continue the way scientists are saying that they're going to. We're all going to be in our homes for the next 8 weeks or so. So very limited going out. People are going to be limited to the media and social media. So, that's an opportunity somewhat for us to reach out. I'm afraid. Well, could you repeat the question?
Basically, how do you see people similar to the Great Depression kind of thing? Like,
yes.
How, like, do you see, like, that was kind of an accelerant to people unionizing? I haven't heard anything, but do you know of anything where it's like that, this might trigger people to start unionizing because it's a matter of life and death kind of for people because they need something?
I will say, during the Great Depression, there were tons of people laid off, obviously, and fired. And that's the case here with service workers and all other industries, a bunch of other industries right now. Those people actually formed unemployed councils right down to the neighborhood. Each neighborhood, for instance, in Chicago, had its own union of unemployed people. And they had meetings every week or twice weekly. You can read more about it in that case, about the unemployed councils, but they had massive demonstrations of thousands, tens of thousands of people. They marched on Washington. They demanded, we need to have food, we need to have shelter, basically the same kind of stuff that's going on now. So, even if we are socially isolated, we can, obviously everybody has a different risk and needs to look at that risk differently and make a decision that's right for them and their family. But, as long as we maintain that 6-foot plus distance, we may be able to still have outdoor demonstrations. At the very least, we can drive around places with our cars. So
Yeah.
if it comes to it and the government, thousands of people in Kansas City end up losing their homes, end up hungry, end up, not being able to socially isolate. What are homeless people supposed to do? How are they supposed to socially isolate? If it gets to that point, then we do have options.
Yes.
And there are people that are starting to have those conversations about, if this does get as bad as they're saying that it could, historical precedent has shown that the government isn't exactly the best at taking care of people. Look at Katrina, look at all these other natural disasters. So it's conceivable there may be gaps. So people are already starting to have conversations about food distribution, food production. What if the healthcare system gets overrun and we need to have street medics that are able to set bones and things like that? So people are starting to have those conversations already about what can we do to make the situation better.
And I mean, I am all for government doing things for that. It seems like, but I think you're right. We're gonna need a lot of community, and we're gonna need a lot more human hands solving human problems here. So
yes,
and that's part of what Oasis is about. So we are really excited to see what and how people can help people. If we have any final questions, I know there might have been some questions, but they kind of get lost. I'm trying to have a conversation while reading all your messages. If anyone wants to have one more question, put that in the comments, and then we're going to get to some musical time, our final musical time shortly after that. No more questions. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ariana, for coming out and, well, not coming out, I suppose, but being here, I should say, and sharing with us. That is incredibly important, and I think the timing is really, really good to be hearing from you about what labor has done in the past and what labor's response should be when conditions just are not favorable and are not just. So that is really good to hear. Thank you so much.